Welcome again to the Academy on Computers. This time we explore computer languages. And to give us the words, as usual, Jim Butterfield is here. And Jim, just what do we mean by computer languages?
Well, they're the manner in which you program a computer, Jack. Perhaps languages isn't the best word. We should perhaps talk about instruction codes, because they are the codes that we use to give instructions to the computer. In other words, when we write a program, which is a set of instructions, we must write these instructions in some kind of a code, and the code we use is called the language. If we have a computer chip, for example, it only recognizes one set of codes. It has one set of codes built in, and that is called machine language. That's the only thing that the computer chip itself actually recognizes. Anything else that we might use to communicate with a computer would be artificial. It would need to be translated for us, so that if we write something in, say, BASIC, there's a translator translating it into machine language for us. But whatever kind of a program you want to write, you have to write those instructions in some kind of a language.
All right, but if I want to write a program, how will I know what language to use?
Well, in principle, Jack, you'd choose the kind of language that would do what you wanted to do. For example, if you're writing a business program to handle a lot of data, you might choose a language such as COBOL, because COBOL is very good at that sort of thing. On the other hand, if you were doing something which is mathematical in nature, you might say, well, Fortran is a much better language to write mathematical routine in. You choose it according to your needs. But that's not really the whole story, because you have to recognize there's a pragmatic consideration here, too. When you get a microcomputer, you don't necessarily have all of the languages available on it immediately. Some of the languages are there, some are available at extra cost, some you may have to buy. For some languages, you might even have to add extra boards inside your computer, so that you may have to consider what languages you have, what languages, in fact, you have knowledge of. In fact, there's another consideration. Since most microcomputers come with BASIC built in, chances are very good that BASIC is the first language you'll use and the first language you'll become familiar with, and you'll use it for a lot of jobs.
All right, so I have to be aware of the language that will suit the job I want to do. I have to know the capabilities and the limitations of my machine. Or is there anything else I should keep in mind?
Well, you should be aware that different languages require you to organize your programs and organize your thoughts along certain lines. I'd like to show you a few examples of programs written in varying languages so that you can see some of the things that give the style to programs written in these various languages. Here is a program written in the language APL. What I'd like to draw to your attention here is that we have various student marks here. One student got 63, 85, 92, 74, and the next student got 81. We bundle all of those marks together into a single vector, as we call it in APL, and from then on in we do all of our computation not based on the individual numbers, but on the marks as a group. That's the style of APL. That's why the language puts a certain form on what we're doing. Let's turn to a completely different language. Here's COBOL. And in COBOL, we couldn't possibly show an entire program written in the COBOL language here, so what I've done is I've marked off the four major divisions of a COBOL program. And I'd like to draw your attention to the last two divisions here. Let me give you an example so you can see what I'm saying. Suppose what you're going to do is to have a payroll program, and on disk you have a large amount of information about the employees and their names and addresses and how many hours they've worked and so on. And on the printer you have all of your paycheck forms all ready to go. Are we ready to go? Okay, the first thing you do in a COBOL language program is you write out the data division. This is the important part, because here you'll be drawing a very detailed picture of what your input data and your output data looks like. For example, the information on disk, you'll say how many characters are likely to be in the name, how the amounts are going to be stored, how many values you're likely to see. All of this is described in great detail in the data division. And when you get to the paycheck form itself, you'll describe that. You'll almost draw a picture of it. You'll say, this is what the check looks like, this is where you put the name, this is where the amount goes, this is, and so on, the date. All of the various parts of your input and output are described in meticulous detail in this section, the data division. As a result, When you get down to the procedure division, which is the part of the program where you actually say what you want done in the COBOL language, you have very little that you need to say. You've described the data itself so completely that you have a very small job left to do when you get down to the procedure.
So you could call COBOL a data-oriented language.
That would be a very fair description
Right.
because it puts so much emphasis on data and you're required to describe it in so much detail. Here's a language and here's a program written into another language called Pascal. In this case, we can see more or less from the organization and the indentations in Pascal that the program is laid out in logical modules. And that means you can usually pick out a section of the program, isolate it, focus on it, and see what. For example, here we see the words begin and end. And what occurs between begin and end is a logical module. It's a certain set of instructions to do something. So a program which is written in the Pascal language will tend to be shaped into logical modules. We can contrast this, on the other hand, with the old familiar basic language, in which what you're really doing here, when you write a program in the basic language, is to say what you want done, and what you want done next, and what you want done after that. We don't have the same logical module construction that is almost forced upon us by a language such as Pascal. The basic language is very easygoing, and it lets you put in whatever you think you want to do next.
Jim, are any of these languages better or worse for programming, or can you make that kind of comparison?
You can't really say one language is superior to another. Certainly no language will guarantee you that you'll write a perfect program. I'm sure you could write a rotten program in any language you chose, Jack. Okay? But the idea here is that certain languages do things for you, and particularly for the way you organize things. For example, some languages are structured, and they cause you to organize your information more tightly, more closely, and some say that a better organized program is a better program.
Now, how can a structured language, help me to build a more organized program?
Well, structuring almost means organization, but I'd like to show you a program written in Pascal and give you some more detailed comments on its structure so that you can see how Pascal helps you organize, helps you put your work together. I have over here on the board a program which is written in the language Pascal. It's the same as the one that we saw earlier, and once again we can see logical modules. We can see repeat until. So we can see here's a section, here's a module. I'd like to pick this out in more detail so that you can see the way the language Pascal forces this organization on the program that you write in Pascal. The first few lines are only to tell you what variables you're using and just set up the name of the program. Here's where the program begins, we see the word begin, and here's where the program ends, we see the word end. So we could say, first of all, that this entire thing is a whole program, and the whole program is also a logical module. Now when you're planning, the thing to do is to break down that logical module into smaller chunks and to organize it piece by piece, not exactly bit by bit. The first thing the program does is it writes a title. It says, well, I'll just put in a comment here, print title. Now we've broken our program into two logical modules. Module 1, print the title. Module 2, do everything else. That may seem like a simple organization, but it is organization. Let's look at the next section, Jack. We have a repeat until, and everything in between here is going to be repeated. We can draw that in approximately this manner, so that what happens in here will be repeated until x equals 0. Now we have more and more structure, and we're building it as we go, and that's what Pascal calls upon us to do. We say what we want to do within this repeated structure is we want to ask for a value, that's x, and now the whole point of this program, by the way, is to print the square root of the numbers that you input. Now, as we know, you cannot take the square root of a negative number, and so before we try to take the square root, we must make a decision. Here's our decision, and we see over here the word if. And we say, is x greater than or equal to 0? If it is, we go this way, down this side. This is my yes side, that's the letter y, not a 7. Okay, and down here we say it is a positive number. Yes, we can do the square root, and in here we will do the square root thing here, and I will summarize that by say print the root. But on the other hand, if x is not greater than or equal to 0, it's a negative number, and you can't take the square root, so we have to go down this way, and if else we do this and say, nope. Now, the point here is not that you organize programs, which you definitely need to do. The Pascal language calls upon you to do that kind of organization. In BASIC, you might not be able to organize things so tightly because the language is much more permissive. You pick a language to do the job that you want.
Thank you, Jim. And Jim and I will be back with our three guests to talk more about languages right after this.
Here's a message for participants and viewers of the TVO Academy on Computers and Education. In order to accommodate the spring break observed in most school systems at this time of year, next week's episode of the Academy will be a repeat of tonight's program. We invite you to tune in for program 7 of the Academy 2 weeks from tonight, Wednesday, April 6th at 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock Central Time.
Our three studio guests are people who use a variety of computer languages. We have a secondary school teacher who's also a writer, a professor of computers and education, and an editor, teacher, and consultant. Jim, let's talk some more about computer languages.
Okay, our guests use computer languages both for writing programs for themselves and also in the field of education. I'd like to ask them, what kind of computer languages do you use? David Williams.
90% of the time the same language as my computer uses, namely BASIC. Sometimes I branch out into machine language. I teach BASIC. Sometimes I teach slightly better BASIC than I use myself, but it's BASIC all the same.
Okay, Rena.
Well, I started using Logo during the last year, and it became available on Micro, and my computer talks Logo now, and I've taught a little bit of it, but I also taught BASIC last year.
So you've come over to Logo recently. Is there any special reason why?
Well, first of all, I just think it's fun. I'm enjoying every minute of working in Logo. It doesn't seem like programming. It seems like playing or something like that. I get a kick out of it. And then I also believe it's great for children, and that's what my research is about.
David Humphreys.
Well, I play in BASIC, and I play in Lisp, and I play in Forth, and I'll play in any language anybody wants to pay me for.
Okay, now you hear a great deal about going out and choosing a language, and that sounds all very well. But you have to face it, when you go out and buy that computer, you know that there's going to be one built-in language for free. And the question that comes is, do you really have a choice when you're a beginner? Dave Williams.
No, I don't think so, not reasonably. The machine has a language built in. Why be perverse and insist that it try to understand something else? It can be done, but it would be a very strange thing to insist on.
Do you agree, Rena?
No, I don't. I think the machines are changing very rapidly. The machines of nowadays are coming out with other languages like Pascal, like Logo, and who knows what else will come on future machines. But very, very soon we will have other languages on micros built in even.
But won't you have to pay extra for these languages?
Not necessarily. I think Pascal is one candidate for a language that will come built into machines.
I'd like to ask you a question about that, Rena. When you go into a computer store, you see all of these books, 300 things that you can do with BASIC, and 750 basic games, and how to program in BASIC, and how to program better in BASIC, and things like that. Doesn't BASIC really, because of all of the literature available for it, doesn't it still dominate?
Well, not anymore. I find now the literature, the journals are becoming more and more dominated by Logo articles, and very soon you will see a whole long rack of books on Logo.
Yeah, but they're being dominated by Logo because it's a fad at the moment. I mean, it's a very serious thing, Logo in itself, but it's a fad. And most of these books you're getting in the bookstore on Logo and Pascal are simply repeating what you've got in BASIC. And at the present moment, not looking a year or 2 years, but when you're buying now, you're going to be laying out $200 or $300 more for one of these languages when you've already got BASIC in the machine. And you've got perfectly adequate books written by all sorts of people and all the kind of application programs that you can put in yourself and not have to buy extra things to run them with.
Let's talk about computer languages for children. What do you think the best language would be for a young person to start programming a computer? Rena?
Well, I believe it's Logo. It was meant to be for children. That's how it was developed initially. And it talks the language of children, a very simple language, and it's very easy. We've seen children learning Logo very easily.
But what skills would a child learn by programming in Logo?
They will learn the general skills of programming, plus there is a package of turtle geometry which will teach them some geometric skills and estimation of numbers and the meaning of numbers. They get a new meaning for numbers, which is concrete, which they can see on the screen. So they learn a lot about math and geometry, but also generally about organizing processes, breaking them up into smaller components, and so on.
I see. David Williams, are you a logo fan too?
Well, I'm a fan of turtle geometry, and I've been known to use turtle geometry on a blackboard without having a computer in the room, simply by using a piece of chalk and turning it and moving it across the board and teaching various theorems concerning angles and so on, which the kids seem to pick up very quickly that way. As far as using logo for more serious purposes, I'm not convinced. There are many things which can be done with BASIC, which after all is in the computer already, which are, I won't say impossible, but certainly more difficult to do in logo.
Well, I certainly disagree. It's the opposite. There are some programs that I can't refer to specific ones now, like biology programs, the animal programs, that are so easy to program in logo that I've switched now. I'm teaching a course, and some of my students who used to program only in BASIC discovered how much easier it is to program those things. Games, if they are games, sort of educational games. On logo, it's so much easier on a logo machine.
But what
program
happens?
The same things.
I see. What happens after the first language? Where do you go after you learn your logo or your BASIC or whatever the language is that you begin with? Where do you expand to? What's the language for high school students? David?
Assuming they know BASIC already, I think it's rather good fun to teach them some machine language, to let them have some insight as to what's going on inside the machine at the actual bits and bytes level, rather than thinking in terms of a pseudo-intelligent entity which one tends to think of in a higher level language. And one can do all kinds of things in machine language which are very difficult, if not impossible, to do in any high level language.
A lot of people think the machine language is very hard to program. Is that true?
Ask some of my students. A lot of them prefer it to BASIC.
Well, yeah, but what's your opinion? Because they're not here for me to ask.
Yeah.
Well, realistically, no, it's not hard. If you have an assembler, it's just as easy to write in machine language to do simple, repetitive tasks as it is to do in a high-level language. And the speed is amazing. It's lovely and gratifying.
Yes, well, it's always nice to see a program that works very, very zippily that way. I wonder, for people who don't know anything about computer languages and who may be wondering, is there any relationship between a computer language and a foreign language? Rena, what do you think?
Well, I don't think the comparison makes much... Well, it makes sense only in terms of the definition. The definition of programming languages, syntax, is defined by means of, or usually is recently defined by means of a phrase structure grammar. Particularly context-free grammars have been used to define languages like Algol, for instance, Algol, Pascal, and so on. And the terms phrase structure grammar, the model has been defined by Noam Chomsky, who was a linguist, and it was for the purpose of natural language syntax. However, it was unsuccessful for natural languages because the natural languages are too complex for that kind of model, or for any simple model. For programming languages, it was just the right kind of model.
It's much easier to learn a programming language
That's
than
right.
a natural language. If you try to learn some language that's very different from English, such as, say, Arabic, you've got a really difficult task on your hands. You've got thousands of words to learn. You've got a different alphabet to learn, different concepts behind the sentence structure, and so on. Any reasonable programming language, high-level programming language, is deliberately made to resemble English. It has only maybe 70 or 80 words, which is very much fewer than any natural language. And it's very simple and logically set out, so that you don't have to, there are no irregular verbs in BASIC.
Well, Dave, you won't convince me that APL resembles English, but I think I could say, are you trying to say, though, that anybody can learn to program? It's just putting in the right amount of effort?
Of course.
Okay. David, I think you had something to say.
Well, I think that's true, but I also think it's simplistic, and I also think that you're being far too complex about it. I mean, Noah Chomsky has never helped me in any one of my computer classes. In fact, I'm certain they'd run through the door if I mentioned whatever you mentioned. But the feeling I have about it is that the computer languages we have at the moment are essentially a code. And you're learning a code, and we accept a kind of convention that we'll talk about them as languages, and we will ennoble ourselves by talking about them in terms of syntax and grammar. I think if we hold to that, then we will continue holding with languages like BASIC, and we will continue with outgrowth from Lisp like Logo. And that's where the matter will stand.
Okay, now today we know that languages that use interpreters are friendly but slow, and languages that use compilers are not terribly friendly, but boy, are they fast. And I'm wondering, do you see anything developing in the future that will make languages have the best of both worlds? David Williams, what do you think?
Well, in fact, many languages now can be either interpreted or compiled. You can write your code using an interpreter to debug it and do all the user-friendly things, and then having written it, you can compile it and have a program that runs like lightning.
David Humphreys.
Yeah, I agree. You can do anything you want with any one of these languages, particularly if they are an interpreted language. You can add a compiler to it, and you get a certain amount of flexibility, which I haven't noticed, for instance, in the more modernistic languages like Pascal and Logo. Basic you can play around with. You can do a part interpreted and then call it up in a compiled form to, say, do your graphics, do a lot of number crunching, or things like that.
Well, Pascal has a compiler, too.
Yeah, I've seen the Pascal compilers. I've also seen people limp on crutches as well.
You're not a Pascal fan?
Not a bit.
Okay, I have a quick question for you here about whether languages take some getting used to. Did you ever start out with a language that seemed terribly, terribly difficult and then suddenly became very easy? Or did you hate it at the beginning and then it became much easier? David.
Well, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago that many people feel that machine language is difficult. And that is a bit of a deterrent to trying to learn it. And I felt that deterrent. I didn't really want to get into machine language, and it took a push to make me get into it. But when I did, I realized it was fun.
And you're happy there now?
Sure.
Okay, last question. What kinds of languages are we likely to see in the future? For example, 5 years from now, what languages do you think we'll be programming in them? Rena?
Well, I think in 5 years, some of the languages currently available will be used more, like Pascal and Logo, and maybe other high level, maybe the language C will be used. But they're also developing new kinds of languages, actually more computing environments than just languages, like the Smalltalk is one example, and a Boxer language is being now developed in MIT, which draw on, well, they're more general than just programming languages, and they allow for more activities and variety. They allow for designing smaller languages within them.
So they relate to the way you use the computer, not just the language you program it in.
Yeah, and they do draw on the visual aspect, on the spatial metaphor for defining. The user interface is also different. You use the windows on the screen, the graphics, and the pointers to point at a particular item in a menu and things like that. It's a different activity also in the programming rather than typing in English-like commands.
Thank you. David Humphreys.
Well, I think that's going to happen in application programs, but I don't think it's going to happen in languages, because about 5 years ago, I was saying, God, if we keep going with BASIC, then slowly we're going to congeal like a rice pudding going cold. And I think in 5 years, the rice pudding will probably be getting colder because we'll still be using the same things. If not, I may very well have pudding on my face.
What languages will we be using in 5 years?
I think roughly BASIC. Probably Fortran will still be hanging around, although YC are dead. COBOL, unfortunately. Lisp will have probably progressed. But I don't see the languages changing a great deal over the next 5 years, just as 5 years ago I was wishing they would change.
Thank you. Dave Williams.
Well, with the increasing numbers of people who know how to program, we've now got literally millions of people worldwide who can program in BASIC. I think there's an increasing inertia in the world against radical different languages. I'm pretty sure that in 5 years' time, if there's still a world in 5 years' time, that BASIC will be the dominant language of microcomputing. It may very well be, as Rena has said, that there will be different ways of communicating the language to the computer. For example, it may be possible simply to speak your program to the computer rather than type it in on a keyboard. But it will still be the same language BASIC, with minor modifications that we know now.
And that's a good place to stop. Thank you, Rena. Thank you, gentlemen. Jim and I will be back to answer your questions right after this. On Bits and Bytes next week in TVOntario's Computer Academy, Billy and Luba Gore show us all about computer-assisted instruction. From simple drill and practice to the tutorial. We see what's happening today and take a peek at what's coming tomorrow. That's at 9 p.m. At 9:30, I'll be back with Jim Butterfield and guests for further hands-on exploration. Next week, watch Bits and Bytes at 9 and join us at 9:30. All right, Jim, we've just got time for a few questions that have come in since the last program. First one. During your communications demonstration, there were a number of strange characters appearing at the top of the screen. I don't think they meant us, Jim. I think they are called junk. Where did they come from?
Okay, let's reconstruct what happened last week. You were over here, Jack, and I went over to the other computer, and I dialed you on the telephone. You answered, and immediately you connected your computer onto the telephone line. Now, I didn't connect right away. I stood there, and I talked about all the various parts, the program, the keyboard, and the modem, and so on. And while I was talking, my voice was going into the telephone. That was being picked up by your computer. Now, the computer was expecting to receive computer data, and of course, it wasn't getting anything like that. It couldn't make head or tail out of my voice, and the best it could do was to translate it into the nonsense characters that you saw on the screen.
Junk, right? Number 2, how can a ROM chip hold its information permanently? Why doesn't the information disappear when the power goes off?
Well, it's part of the wiring that's in the microchip. I happen to have a photograph here of the insides of a microchip. When they build it at the factory, they put in all of the various pieces to make those ones and zeros part of the circuit. They're wired right in. Now, what you have then is all of these ones and zeros are, if you like, carved in silicon or stone, because that's what silicon really is. They're fixed forever.
In a basic program, what's the difference between a print and a REM statement?
Well, a print statement is an action statement. When you run the program, the print statement will print something for you. Now, an REM statement is not an action statement. When you run the program, the REM statement will do nothing, and the computer will proceed to its next instruction. The REM instruction is there as a remark, as a little bit of information as to what happens next in the program, so that later when you list the program and you're trying to look at it, those remark statements can be very helpful in telling you this next piece of code is intended to do such and such a job.
Jim, can I copy a program from cassette tape to disk?
Yes, you can if you have both a cassette unit and a disk drive on your computer. Normally, all you need to do is to bring it in from the cassette with a load or a C-load command, and then save it out to disk with a save or a desave type of command. Now, I should point out that certain kinds of programs are protected against copying, and then you can't do that sort of thing at all. You'll have a great deal of difficulty copying it, even from a cassette to another cassette.
Just time for one more, Jim. Is there any simple way I can prevent a basic program from being listed? I want to create a program that others can't read or copy.
Well, there aren't any simple ways of doing that. There are certain methods, but they tend to vary from computer to computer, and they tend to be rather complex. I should mention, however, that for somebody who is an educator who wants to make a program that cannot be read by the user, he can usually encode or encrypt the answers so that the students can't read what the answers are just by listening.
That's all the time we have for now, Jim. Next time, computer-assisted instruction. Jack Livesley with Jim Butterfield inviting you to join us then on The Academy.
This program